Now, is there a separation or a division between the environment and the peace movements? In 2015, I'm old enough to think of 1900s, right? And those of us who came up through the radical movements of the 60s, 70s, and 70s know you cannot leave anyone behind. Those of us in the 60s who were being asked to, oh, hey, you know, the hippie movement and the leftist movement, the women were supposed to be making the coffee and bringing me my stash, woman. And I'm convinced that that was the beginning of a real movement for equality in women. Anyway, back to 2015. The Cree of northern Quebec had already been through several decades of having their land stolen for hydroelectric power. And perhaps some dribble of that came down to the United States because the Cree went to New York and said, you guys are going to buy this stuff. We want to have a land treaty in Quebec that protects our land. And New York came on board. These were environmentalists who saw that a good portion of northern Quebec was going to be flooded to create hydroelectric power for New York. And so the environmentalists at that time came on board. In the 1990s, and in fact, should I complete that? In fact, the Cree lost. The James Bay project went ahead, and so did the Whale Cove project shortly thereafter. However, they won something else. They won organizational skills. They got a very hefty compensation, which they then used to put their kids through university. And out of that era also came one of the best spoken leader. I say leader with slight differences, because even Matthew Kuncum, who is an incredible leader in our sense, says that he takes his positions to the elders. So he doesn't act alone. 2015, we're all sort of talking about how do we stop uranium mining in northern Quebec, because this is a big issue. What we were able to do with people like bringing together peace activists, environmentalists, mining, anti-mining groups, we had the Cree, the Innu of northern Quebec. We had 3 major councils of Inuit. We had the youth from the Inuit. We brought together the World Uranium Symposium and had more than 300 people in Quebec. Now, and we brought through a declaration that linked uranium mining, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and all through it was the question of the environment. So is there a difference between environmentalists and peace activists? I think my 2 previous speakers have really outlined very well that we're on the same page. And perhaps the only reason we don't see it, or that we're separating them at all, is that we're letting the media separate us. Depleted uranium is another place where we are inextricably linked, because there is no dividing line between the environment and war in that matter. Depleted uranium is uranium-238, and according to the US Department of Defense and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, it is only slightly radioactive, and it is only toxic if consumed in large amounts. That's probably true, except that uranium-238 is radioactive. What does radioactive mean? It means that it inexorably, and that word means can't do anything else. It has to decay. And it decays into radium, radon, responsible for approximately 20% of our lung cancers, and polonium-210, the most toxic substance on Earth. And the amount of a pinhead is what killed Litvinenko in the UK. Great stretches of land in Iraq, Bosnia, Libya, and Syria have been polluted with it. I would posit that we are actually in a revolution, a non-violent revolution to its core, to create a society that's sustainable. We are being held hostage by an outmoded economic system. So we are not merely a revolution that's going to solve disputes peacefully, or a revolution that's going to clean up the environment. We cannot have those things happen without changing the economic system in which we live. Besides being outlandish and illustrating outlandish greed and the recognized illness of hoarding, it is unconscionable that 64 people hold the financial wealth of 50% of humanity. It is absolutely impossible to have a 3% economic growth, and that's what we're told we have to have in order to live in a finite world. So we have to change the story, change the future. Bhutan has it right. We should be measuring the gross happiness index. What I learned in school and university was that humans were essentially competitive, that nature was survival of the fittest, and that life wasn't always fair, and that war was part of human nature. These premises allow us to make prejudice, racism, unethical deeds, if you don't get caught, domination, and the making of war okay. While life still might not be fair, humans need humans to survive. We have skins so thin that we need to wear skins or other products of other animals for warmth or protection. We have only usually one infant per gestation, and that infant has a very long dependency period. These traits made cooperation absolutely paramount. Furthermore, a hunter-gatherer society could not sacrifice its hunters to be killed in war. War, part of human nature? There have always been wars, we've been told. Well, David, in his book, puts the death to that particular myth. Even if it were true, what kind of excuse is it? Dental abscesses, arthritis, common cold, and cancer have also always been with us. But that has not prevented us from devoting great amounts of energy and time to prevent, treat, or cure them. The media plays also on our fear of failure. The social consciousness movements of the 60s were criticized for failing to continue the press for revolutionary change. Same with the criticisms of Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, and the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. But are they failures or just practice runs? So don't fall for the failure story. The knowledge gain is feeding the revolution. And let me say, there cannot not be a revolution. Our Earth depends upon it, and our previous speakers have said that we're warring on the environment. I'm going to just mention the Dakota Access Pipeline because I went online to gather a little bit of information about it, and Wikipedia is clearly written by those who wanted to have the pipeline. The facts and figures in there do not compute with the things that Saskatchewan is just north of North Dakota. And at least 20 of my younger friends and not so young friends went down to participate, came back to raise money, and went back down with blankets. It began as a very small protest, but many people saw that it was much larger issues. It was supported by both Indigenous and settler stock. And it very quickly, the movement there very quickly established a council of elders to whom they referred many of their decision-making process. A kind of a council of sober second thought. As it grew in numbers, the recognition that nonviolence had to be complete became paramount. Through incredible challenges, they had constant airplane surveillance, night and day. It was almost impossible to get a good sleep because you never knew when the airplane was going to go over your particular tent at 250 meters. They used the Dakota Access supporters, the pipeline supporters, used sound cannons with very irregular booms. So you never knew when you were going to be boomed at. They also had police and dog harassment, arrests for misdemeanors, strip searches, the activities of provocateurs. I can't say that. Anyway, actively trying to divide them. And in spite of minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit and high winds, they held it together with more than 5,000 people camping out on the hillsides. If that didn't bring home an enormous number of young people, older people who understood that the revolution was happening, we have to recognize how many people were involved in that. While their victory seemed to be short-lived, there is no doubt that a mighty force was released. Most of us have seen in our lifetime changes we never ever expected. I still gotta go when I see a man pushing a baby carriage. That would never have happened in my childhood. I'm not sure how perverse this is, but it's certainly on all of our airplanes. Nobody smoking. In 1996, nobody smoked in bars in Canada. I could hardly believe I could actually stop for a beer and not go home smelling like I did just ingested a lot of cigarette smoke. We in Canada have left the colonial Indian term behind. Many of us try to refer to the particular tribes by name, but we're not always that good at it. But in 2015, a First Nations woman became the Minister of Justice in Canada, fully qualified. We are leaderless, but I think that's the way we should be, because we are many. We have learned from the 1960s that a movement stalled if drugs or alcohol became habitual, that a revolution needed to be inclusive to age, races, religions, physical abilities, and that violence begat violence repression. So can we do it? I believe it's not a question of whether we can do it, can we do it fast enough? And that's what we're being called to do. We are a movement of millions. Let's act as if we are, change the story, change the future.
All right, I know everyone has a lot of questions. There are 2 microphones on either side of the auditorium. If people will line up, and then I will go back and forth calling on people. And as we actually have a little bit less time than I thought we might, please make your questions short so that we can take as many as possible. And before I take the very first question, I just want to make one more announcement about Gar's book that Richard talked so highly about, the War and the Environment Reader. We believe it's going to be for sale here. We hope so. There will be a table called Just War Books, and it is out, and it's supposed to be on sale here, so look for that, okay? All right. They're there? Yay, okay. All right, and I'm sure Gar will autograph it for you. All right, yes, sir.
Thanks for a great panel, really. Enlightening and inspiring. My name is David Schwartzman. I happen to be a climate, energy, justice activist and scientist. I want to make a very quick point and get your response. The direct greenhouse gas emissions of the Pentagon and the military are certainly sizable, as Naomi Klein has pointed out in her book and so on, but it turns out it's only less than 1% of the total global. So as Michael Clear, picking up from Emery Lovins, calling the Pentagon the Oil Protection Service, they serve the imperial agenda of the military-industrial fossil fuel, nuclear, state terror, and surveillance complex, which is at the core of capital reproduction. So I would just get your reaction. I'm coming to the end. The lack of cooperation to make a transition as fast as possible away from fossil fuel, as our last speaker just pointed out, is being blocked by this complex. Until it's dissolved, the process of dissolution, we will not meet less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is the Paris Agreement. So this is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, ironically, the Pentagon is aware of this problem to the point that they have actually defied their commander-in-chief. Donald Trump has told the Pentagon that they're supposed to cease their planning to prepare for climate change. And the generals and the planners are basically saying, no, we got to do this, because we're going to be losing access to our naval bases on the coast by the end of the century if we don't address it. So we have some unexpected allies in uniform. So the system is starting to crack from the inside. That gives us some hope.
Okay, sir.
Hi.
I don't think I'll jump in to add anything to that just now.
No,
Okay. Well, my question will be about in reference to the story, changing the story. But my first thing I want to say is just how inspired I am when I see this many people, not this many people, there's not a lot of people here, but these people who have been at it for decades of being concerned about care for humanity and people not being toasted in their homes by war. But I want to stress the importance of accuracy in our comments, that if we change the story, we want to be very cautious in what we say. And one of the first comments that came out was that the greatest destruction of human life on Earth caused by humans was war. And in my understanding of statistics, war killed 100 million people in the last century, but genocides, governments killing their own people, was 160 million. And governments ignoring the needs of their people. Smallpox alone killed more than war and genocide combined in 70 years of that century. And the story I'd like to change is that it's not that war is the problem, but it's governments that fight the wars, that create the genocides, that don't bring health. You know, we talk about truth, the importance of truth. Our founding fathers said something about, we hold these truths to be self-evident. You don't argue with those truths. All people are created equal, and until governments get that fundamental principle right, and it's our job as citizens to get that idea right to our elected officials. We are the government. If it's doing something bad, it's because we didn't do it right. So that's the story I want to change. I just want to get your feedback if that's like kosher or not, whatever.
I think that question deserves a round of applause.
And I'd like to respond to it. And what I would like to say is that as long as we are organizing society with a dominator system, we end up eventually expropriating most of the resources in order to keep that system alive. So what we have to do is change the system.
And there's where we have such an enormous job to help change the public awareness, the broad public awareness of how all of the issues intersect. I really appreciated, Dale, your statement that we can go to Nashville and find friends. I think this is enormously important in terms of our understanding all the dynamics of the last presidential election and where we go from here and which groups we work with and how we communicate with people who are as deeply concerned as we are and were, I'm convinced, very deeply manipulated by all of the right-wing media, including ones that to most of us are invisible. And so changing the story can certainly change the outcome and change our collective future and our alliances.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Leah. Thanks for your panel. And thanks for your vision. I think we really need a better world. And I suppose you also mentioned a system that's really true, but the system is really rigid. Election is rigid. Democracy is rigid. It's really, we don't have a choice but being victimized. Unless we really, everybody stand up and for justice and fairness in our daily life. Otherwise, everybody will be victimized. Our government gain is worse than the war, and it's worse than the MS-13. So unless everybody say we are the leaders, we have a good vision, we want to stand up for justice and fairness, otherwise it sounds very kind of hopeless, because it's come in a vicious cycle. I call it that way, because it's not just Democrat or Republican. It's really the big guys control all our life, take away everything we have, whether it's a property, a home, or your rights, everything supposed to be protected by Constitution. So I hope, based on your vision, we have to move the language, the justice and fairness first, There's nothing that you can say, forget it. We got to protect ourselves individually. It's not going to help. So I just hope that everybody really can spread this word and share with everybody, move everything forward, especially in the election time. And election is every day, because they control every moment. They take away everything you have. If you want to speak a word against those, they want to take away everything we have.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any comments?
Thanks, Leah, for putting together. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, just one moment, Ron. Do you have a...
No, I'll just respond to that because she's right. I mean, it is. If we start with ourselves looking at justice and peace, we could all go sit on a mountain and sort of meditate, but I don't think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about being actively seeking out, being corrected by young people usually if we make a blooper and don't include a sector. So yes, I think we have to start there.
Okay, Brian?
Hello, I'm Brian Terrell. And I think one of the things we have to deal with in trying to make an intersection between the environmental and the anti-war movement is not just the media and not just the outside pressures, but there is a deliberateness on the part of many environmentalists not to be associated with the likes of us. And I felt that back in 1978, I was in the campaign in Colorado to shut down Rocky Flats. And those of us who suggested that a hydrogen bomb being detonated would be an environmental disaster, and who tried to, the majority of the people involved in that campaign were trying to keep it on the environmental issue about what's happening to the groundwater, what's happening to the air, what's happening to the land. It was actually suggested that we might be provocateurs coming in to wreck the movement by associating it with, in those Cold War days, with anti-Americanism and being soft on communism, almost as though if we could make an atom bomb safely and cleanly, it would be okay. So today we have now, with the idolization of the military and with the fear of terrorism and Islamophobia taking the place of anti-communism, we have friends and potential allies who are reluctant to be critical of militarism and are trying to maintain a pro-environment movement without making those connections. And as we're trying to make those connections, we're coming into resistance from some of those friends.
Well, I think we have to learn from that resistance. When we first started planning the World Uranium Symposium, the Mining Watch people were really opposed to the idea of including nuclear weapons and war as part of that symposium. At the end of the symposium, because they got all their speakers, we got their speakers on as well. And incidentally, that was an interesting conference to find speakers for, because my co-programmer, who was from Mining Watch, insisted that we put 50% of our speakers as women. And when you start looking specifically, women and the other 50%, and somehow or other we had to have some 50% of people of color. And when you start actively looking for them, they're all there. It's just that we are not used to doing it. And so, yeah.
We have time for just one, I'm sorry, but we have time for just one more question. Try to be brief, Ron. Go ahead.
My name is Ron Fisher. In the last submarine I was on, I'm retired Navy, as Leah is. We could have wiped out over 100 cities. We had, in 1972, we had the Trident missile zone, the old Poseidons, over 100 cities, multiple warheads. Now, I would have done that. I was the XO. I was taught at the Naval Academy, obedience. My favorite book now is Sin of Obedience. It absolutely is a sin. And I want to put the question I've got is, what are the obstacles for us enforcing the Kellogg-Briand Treaty that outlawed all wars in 1928. Yes. And we've got obstacles, but we need to figure out those out and fix them. Now, I'm proposing we use the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. There's even a goal for training, for war, ending wars, ending poverty, ending hunger. I have a plan outlined on my website. I have a lot of good training and planning, and it's peoplenow.org. And we have a plan on there for ending the wars, ending environmental. But I'd just like to talk about the Kellogg-Briand and why in the hell we haven't enforced it before. Thank you.
Ron.
That's a very good point. David Swanson has spoken extensively about that, and it's in his books and publications. The resort to law is definitely something that we need to be paying attention to. I, a while ago, wrote an article entitled Pay Your Taxes, Go to Gitmo. There is a law in the book that says if you're caught guilty sending money to a terrorist organization overseas, when we pay our taxes, we do that.
You know, as this discussion evolves this morning, what I'm beginning to envision as being really, really useful would be more careful, detailed discussion and writing and publications on how the anti-war movement and the environmental movement in all of their complexities have related to each other, when and in what ways we did and when we haven't. I don't think any of us has a really full sense of how that has gone over the last half century. We can put that together with a good deal more clarity, and it'll be useful for our future campaigning.
And Gar, I think that you meant to include in the anti-war movement peace and justice. Justice, because I think that the justice movements from Idle No More and Black Lives Matter really do matter.
Absolutely. Let's have another round of applause for our great speakers. And we will have a 15-minute break now, and we'll try to keep on schedule. The next panel will be Preventing Domestic Environmental Damage of Militarism. So please be back on time, and I'm sure it's going to be another excellent panel. Thank you very much.